and welcome to episode 3 of In Our Midst, where we feature people and organizations making positive change in our community and in the world. My name is Phil Rosner and I am your host. In this episode, I will be talking with Dr. Mary-Wynne Ashford, who is a longtime activist in the area of nuclear weapons abolition. It was a fateful evening in 1984 when she attended a speech at the University of Victoria, which featured Australian physician, author, and longtime anti-nuclear advocate Dr. Helen Caldicott. After hearing Dr. Caldicott's impassioned speech on the explicit threat the world was under due to the great proliferation of nuclear weapons, Dr. Ashford decided to dedicate herself to do whatever she could to rid the world of these horrifying weapons of mass destruction. This led her to work from 1984 to 2004 with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, where she served as co-president from 1998 to 2002. The organization was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize for its work to end the threat of nuclear war. Dr. Ashford has written a book titled Enough Bloodshed, 101 Solutions to Violence, Terror, and War, and has appeared on 2 TED Talks. Please join me now as we delve deeper into the life and work of Dr. Mary-Wynne Ashford. Hello, Dr. Ashford. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, and thank you.
Dr. Ashford, I wonder if we could maybe start by having you tell us a little bit about your past, where you were born and raised, etc.
Sure. I was born in Saskatchewan, but it was in just at the beginning of the war. So my dad got stationed to Edmonton, and we moved there. I grew up in Edmonton, and I guess I'll just tell you the things that are relevant to me today. And that one of them is when I was 10, the university put on a program for 10-year-old children in children's theater. And it was the very first time anybody had talked about children's theater at all. So we had a director who came from Toronto and put on a couple of plays. And I just loved it. I just was totally hooked. So from then on, the university continued with programs in children's theater. And I went on to do speech studies with a wonderful teacher there named Walter Kaza, who is very, very distinguished in the province of Alberta. And then went to University of Alberta, did a couple of degrees there. I graduated as a teacher, science degree, and then teaching, and taught in a high school there, which I also loved. Later on, we moved to Calgary, and my dad was dying. And I was very, very impressed by his family doctor. Not so impressed by some of the others. And I found myself thinking, I could do this better. You know, they know a lot, but they're not all that kind. So I decided I would go back and do some pre-med courses and see if I could get into med school. By this time, I was 37. So I did get in. I graduated with a completely different notion of how to work collaboratively, and that has just been a wonderful experience for me. So I interned out here in Victoria, and then very shortly after that, in 1984, I heard Helen Caldicott speak at the University of Victoria, and she was talking about nuclear weapons, something I'd never, ever paid any attention to. And I was deeply, deeply shocked. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think of anything. I mean, I was going to work, but I was just exhausted trying to think how I I didn't want to get involved in this. You know how you think, well, it's not my problem. It's it's your problem. It's everybody's problem. And by this time, I was in a new relationship, and between us, we had 7 kids, most of them teenagers. So it was a big thing when I said to them that I was going to get involved in nuclear disarmament. But my son Graham, who was in grade 12 then, said, well, it's about time, Mom. And I thought, what? And he said, haven't you ever noticed all the posters in our bedrooms? And here were these posters for bands like U2 and Pink Floyd and all anti-nuclear groups and so on. And it was then that I realized that my kids were really, really frightened, and with good reason.
It's interesting, Dr. Ashford, because in 1962, I was in grade 6 when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place. And, you know, I remember the principal asked us to go to the basement of the school and go down on our hands and knees right against the concrete wall and put our hands over our heads. It was really frightening. And obviously, it was really touch and go during that crisis. Where were you at that time, and how did that affect you?
Yeah, I was in Edmonton teaching high school at Bonnie Doon, and Bonnie Doon is way across South Edmonton from where we lived in the interns' quarters. My first husband was also a doctor, so we lived in the interns' quarters, and he worked at the university hospital. We had a little Volkswagen Beetle, and we decided the best plan for us would be to outfit the Beetle and head for the mountains. We were going to head for Hinton. So we had all kinds of survival equipment packed in there, and food and sleeping bags and all of that. And the plan was that I would drive the car to school, of course, but if we got the air raid warning, then I would zoom across on White Avenue to the university and pick him up. We didn't think deeply about it, because at the minute you think deeply about it, you realize everyone in South Edmonton is going to be on White Avenue, because that's the only road that goes right across and then out the highway. So there would be no possible way that I could get back to the university hospital in an emergency. We'd be all jammed up. My father was one of the leaders of civil defense at that time, and his plan, the civil defense plan, was that they would have volunteers all along the highway handing out soup. And I said, Dad, nobody's going to volunteer, first of all, but nobody's going to stop for soup. They want to get out of that city because it's got an air base. But in a way it was denial, in a way it was terror, and it was very justified terror. But on the other hand, you can't face everything that is going to go wrong. Because it's paralyzing.
Right. Yeah. So back to 1984 and seeing Dr. Caldecott and the effect that she had on you with her speech. Please, could you now outline kind of the path that you ended up taking that brought you into the apex of working for nuclear weapons abolition?
Yeah. I guess the crisis was after the third night of not sleeping and still working in the office. In the middle of the night, I actually thought, I wonder if there is a God, and if there's a reason that I'm here right now with all of the education and experience that I've got. I mean, a teacher, a doctor, a parent with experience in public speaking. Did that mean that I had to do something? And half of me was saying, you can't, you're too busy and you can't take on anything, and all those reasons that I couldn't. But the other side of that is, if I'm not willing to do it, and I actually have the capacity, who do I think is going to do it? Who is there? And Helen Caldecott said, it's going to take every single person You bring whatever you've got, and everybody has to work if we're going to save the planet. So that was when the next morning I told the kids and Russell, and Russell then told me, Russell was from Edinburgh, and he told me about when he graduated from med school and finished his internship, he was then drafted and went to the South Pacific on the HMS Warrior, observing the hydrogen bomb tests in the Pacific. And he was so deeply shocked, he never ever talked about it. And he said, if you take this on, I'll look after everything at home when you're gone, when you're having to do whatever. And otherwise I couldn't have done all the stuff that I did, because he looked after my 3 kids and his own, whichever one currently was coming to stay with us. So the first thing I did was I called up another doctor, Eleanor Powell, who was in charge of the local physicians group, and said, okay, so I'm ready to do something. What should I do? And she said, nobody knows what to do. If you see something that looks promising, then do it. And if you're asked to speak, don't ever say no. So that's good advice. It's pretty clear. And I've also thought, I knew of women being active in this. And so in my office, this woman came in. She had long hair and a long skirt, flowered skirt, and army boots. And I said to her, are you in the peace movement? And she said, yeah, of course. And I said, well, I'd like to do something about nuclear weapons. And she said, great. There's a meeting of Voice of Women on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. My house gave me her address. So I went there, and as a result, I was in 2 different parts of the movement. One was the women's side, and the other was the physicians. But at the international level, most of the doctors involved were men, because the women, if they were physicians, couldn't manage a family and IPPNW and their jobs. So at IPPNW, I was usually the only woman. I went as an observer on the board for a while, and then as the Canadian rep and the North American rep. So there I was seeing kind of the man's approach to nuclear disarmament. And at the same time, through the women's group, I saw a completely different perspective, because while the men were talking about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and how many bombers and so on, the women were talking about security means being able to walk downtown at night without fear. And it's a completely different approach to what is real security. And the women simply reject the notion that we're made more secure by having militaries. So that was my initiation into the women's movement, as well as into the peace movement. And it's been amazing. So at the level of the international sphere, that was because in IPPNW, we had world congresses with many of the outstanding speakers of the day, including Al Gore when he was a young senator. And he spoke in Moscow. I remember that. And, prime ministers spoke. Those were very, very important times. And eventually, members of IPPNW, the leadership, met with Mikhail Gorbachev. And he was so affected by that, he wrote in his book, Perestroika, that there were 2 things that affected him. One was the hundreds of thousands of letters from little children all over the world, and the other was his meetings with doctors. And that was just before he went and met Reagan in Reykjavik, and they set up the first of the major bilateral treaties, which have lasted up until last year. So working at that level, I started out being the only woman on the platform. And that was becoming embarrassing for the organization, that not to have gender parity on the platform. And so I got asked to speak more and more frequently, and gradually I got better at giving speeches too. So I ended up speaking really everywhere, speaking in Europe and speaking all through France. I did a project for IPPNW where I went to France and toured 26 cities and talked to the doctors to explain why we have to be concerned about nuclear weapons, and that being against nuclear weapons did not mean that you were a communist, because in France you were immediately labeled as a communist if you were anti-nuclear weapons. As time went on, I participated more and more with occasions when I met with dignitaries, including there was a meeting that Gorbachev put on in Rome after he'd left the Soviet Union, and it was a meeting of the people who'd won the Nobel Peace Prize, and I went to represent IPPNW because we won it in 1985. And at that meeting, it was, Lech Walesa was there from Poland, and all these other amazing peace Nobel Prize winners, Nobel laureates. And at that time, a group of us were taken to have a private audience with the Pope. That was Jean Paul, the Pope at that time, the Polish Pope. So that was a very moving time because he had written a statement for us that was incredible. It could have been written by any one of us. It was a very, very powerful statement in opposition to nuclear weapons.
Interesting. So now, Dr. Ashford, if we could kind of fast forward to 2020, in your opinion, have there been any major inroads with regard to nuclear weapons abolition in recent times? Is the situation improving, or is it getting worse?
Oh, yeah. Opinion? It's phenomenal what's happening right now. Excuse me. In 2007, IPPNW began a new organization, called ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And it's a coalition of hundreds of organizations, like-minded organizations. It includes the Red Cross and the churches, the World Council of Churches, and so on. So it's a very widespread coalition. And the goal was to get a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. Then in 2000, I guess it would have been about 2013 or 14. I forget when the first one was. Norway set up the first humanitarian conference to talk about the danger, the humanitarian consequences of a nuclear war. And they invited like-minded states to come to Norway to talk about that. Well, these diplomats were so shocked to learn the real consequences of a nuclear war, because they never talk about that at the UN. They talk about deterrence and security and the wording of resolutions, but they weren't conscious at a gut level of what would actually happen. And those diplomats were so shocked, they said, we have to meet again. So they met again 6 months later in Mexico and then in Vienna. And then in Vienna, Austria said, we will take this to the General Assembly. So that was a massive step from having a civil society organization pressing for this and working with these governments, working really tightly with them, presenting expert opinion in a whole variety of fields, and really a collaboration that bore fruit. Then to get it to the UN, and eventually the treaty came forward, and the UN approved it by 122 countries, but then they had to each take it back to their own country before it could be signed and ratified, but they approved of the wording of the treaty. So then in 2017, ICAN won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing that treaty to the UN. The situation now is that the treaty has been signed and ratified by 47 countries. When it's 50 countries, in other words, 3 more ratified signatures, it becomes international law. And that means that those 50 countries are bound by the law that says that they can't build or store or transport or sell or facilitate or host or threaten or use, obviously, nuclear weapons. So at the moment, the nuclear powers have not signed that agreement, and neither have the countries that are supposedly sheltered by the nuclear weapons states. So Canada has not signed. NATO countries have not signed. But once this becomes international law, the stigma of being actually outriders instead of being a part of international law, that stigma is huge. And the pressure that will be brought to bear on countries is going to grow. And one of the NATO countries will cave into that. It may be one of the European countries first. It should have been Canada. We should already have signed it. We used to be known as the honest broker at the UN, and we've been really, really important players in nuclear disarmament talks for decades. So now it's a great shame that we're not there in that group of the first countries. We can sign it, of course, after it comes into effect. You can then accede to it. But there's a certain prestige in being in the first 50 signatories.
So we really need to send letters to the Prime Minister.
We need to send letters to the Prime Minister and say, get on with it. The vast majority of Canadians and the vast majority of people all over the world want abolition of nuclear weapons. There's absolutely no question. Every country is over 85% of the population in favor of the abolishing of nuclear weapons. So the governments need to get behind that at last.
With regards to this whole situation, do you have any final thoughts, Dr. Ashford? I mean, what would you suggest, for instance, to the younger generation that they could do?
Yeah.
What do you consider is the most effective way, like anybody, what we could do to pick up the torch and kind of continue this campaign?
A really important thing is to recognize that the weaponization of the world, the militarization of the world, has terrible consequences for climate change. And young people are very, very deeply engaged with climate change. But what they're not addressing, because most people don't know it, is that the world's militaries are the greatest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. They're the greatest users of petroleum in the world, and their emissions are not subject to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They don't have to report them. So it's like a big secret that, when these bombers go off, they're burning some 14,500 gallons of fuel an hour. Imagine. So one bomber in a test flight is using as much petroleum as the ordinary motorist in a year. So we can't continue with that. And if the young people make the connection and raise awareness of that, that's a really important thing. They don't need guidance to be told, write letters, march, get placards. They are just full of brilliant, creative ideas, and they will pick this up. They are making the connections now with militarism and climate change, and we're starting to see various areas, especially in Canada, where young people are taking up this torch. For the rest of us, I say it's same old, same old. Talk to everybody you know, get them all to write letters to the Prime Minister. Right. And we used to say, don't worry about whether you address him as Right Honourable or whatever. We voted these people into service. And so you can write to him as Dear Justin if you want to, but at least write to him and say, I am totally, utterly opposed to nuclear weapons. I want Canada to be a leader. Please sign the ban treaty. Really simple message. There was a woman in Saskatoon. Let me finish off with this. There was a woman in Saskatoon who used to do something I loved. She would phone up Prime Minister Mulroney at that time and say to the secretary, could I speak to the Prime Minister, please? And the secretary would say, well, I'm very sorry, but he's busy at the moment. Could I take a message? And she said, yes, do. Tell him that this is Joanna Miller from Saskatoon, and I want him to work on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And the secretary would say, fine, thank you very much, Mrs. Miller. And then the next week, Joanna would phone back again. I'd like to speak to the Prime Minister, please. Well, you can be sure that they laughed about those phone calls that the secretary did tell the Prime Minister just because it was such a lovely, creative thing.
Perseverance.
Perseverance and
Yes,
humor. Yeah,
exactly.
all of it counts.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ashford. We so appreciate it.
It's been lovely. Thanks very much, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of In Our Midst. We would love to hear from you. If you would like to contact us with an idea for a guest for our show, please email us directly at inourmidst@shaw.ca. Thank you so much.